Welcome back to the TimCo Retail Manager course. This course focuses on real-world application development. In this video, we'll be implementing continuous deployment to our development API location. When the build completes, it's going to automatically trigger a deployment. Now, for those of you who are new to this project, welcome. If you're just interested in the topic this video covers, I think you'll get a great introduction to in a real-world setting. If you'd like to start this project from the beginning with us, there is a link in the description to the full playlist in order. There's also a link to the Phase 1 course if you want to get up to speed faster and would like the source code for each step. Either way, I'd appreciate if you give this video a thumbs up. Doing so helps spread the word and ensure that more people will be helped by this video. Okay, let's head over to the browser. Now here is our Azure DevOps site, and what we're going to work on today is in pipelines. And we're going to work on a release. We already have our pipeline for deployment, for building. So it's a continuous integration build, and that's working. But now we have our release. And our release is where we're going to do our continuous deployment. Now, as I said previously, you could do a release right in pipelines, but I prefer not to do that. I prefer to keep them separate. That way, you get to choose what you build and you get to choose what you deploy separately. So I like to build everything. If you're going to push source code to this Azure DevOps site, I want to build it. I want to make sure that all the unit tests pass. I want to make sure that it actually builds. And if there's any problems, I want to discover them right away. And so if you push up a separate branch that maybe it's going to be for a pull request or something else, I want to build that. Not just the master branch, okay? Now for the release pipeline, I'm only going to release on the master branch. So if you push to master, I'm assuming what that means is this is ready to go to our development server. Now if you're not familiar with a deployment system, as in having more than one environment, let me explain real briefly. Now every environment is different. What you're going to find for this project may be different than what you find in the industry and wherever you work. So every company has to do it a little bit differently, but the idea is that you don't just say, I have source code and I put it in production. That's a really scary step to take. And if you have ever done that, and I have because I've worked for companies that do that, that's a terrifying process. And if it's not a terrifying process, it's because you're not experienced enough to have seen the problems that can cause. Because it feels fine when it works and you get super confident because, I'm just making this little change here and there. But at some point, that's going to bite you. And when it does, all of production goes down. Or even worse, maybe production doesn't go down, but now all the data is getting corrupted. That's a huge issue. And so we have, in most environments, is we have this multi-step deployment, where we first deploy to a development environment where we all try it out. And then we have maybe a staging or a pre-production or something similar, a QA spot, where you deploy it again. And this time it's kind of like the preparation for production, making sure it's all right, making sure the deployment continues to work the way it should. And then we deploy to production. Now, some companies have 5 steps in there. Some companies have just development and production. I prefer to have 3, at least. So I have a development, and I have a staging, and I have production. In this course, because it really is just development, we probably won't have our following stages. We'll probably just have a development stage. But just note, that's what I'd probably do. So in this video, what we're going to do is create a new pipeline, and we're going to deploy our application automatically whenever we push to master. So let's create a new pipeline. And this creates a pipeline for us that says, what template do you want to use? We want to use the Azure App Service Deployment because we're going to deploy to our Azure Web API right here. Okay, so apply this. Now, just because I select this does not mean that I'm locked into this and only this. I get to choose. I can change this later. I can deploy or create an empty job and then add things manually. It's really up to me. going to say apply. And it says, okay, what stages do you have? Currently stage 1. I'm going to call this development. And what that means is this is the development deployment. You can add stages and have then staging and then production or something like that. But for now, we're just going to have this one stage. I'll click on I can close this out right here. Click on the one job, one task link. And it says, okay, what do you want to do? Well, first of all, notice we were highlighting up here on development. Remember before I said that pretty much everything is clickable. So that's got information, this has got information. So just make sure you click on all of these. Don't forget there's also the variables tab, the retention tab, the options tab, and the history tab, as well as the pipeline to go back to where you were. So on development, I need to hook up to a Azure subscription, which I have an available subscription. But if you don't, you can go to Manage, and you can connect your subscription. So say Create Service Connection, select the Azure Resource Manager, you'd hit Next, you'd say Automatic, you'd hit Next, and it's going to find your subscription, or it's going to ask you to log in possibly. Then go to Resource Group, find that, and so on. Okay? But I believe ours is already hooked up. So if we select Available, we can select it, and it says, oh, we need to authorize it. No worries. There's a button here that says Authorize. And that should authorize for us. And if it had any problems, it would flag, but usually all that means is that it's connecting and saying, oh, yep, you are who you say you are, because you're already logged in. So now this is authorized. Now I can say, what app service name do I want to deploy to? And in here we have a few options. But I don't see my option here. But notice up here it says Web App on Windows. I believe it's on Linux. If so, let's refresh this. There we go, TimCo API. So it's a Linux deployment. So now that knows it's a Linux deployment. If we had a startup command, we could put it there. We don't. So now I can go to Run on Agent. I get to choose what build agent to build this on. I could choose Ubuntu. I could choose Windows 2019. I think I'm going to choose Ubuntu because of the fact that it's going to deploy to Linux. I'll leave everything else the same. I'll go down to Deploy Azure App Service, and notice it's already getting filled in because I selected a whole bunch of stuff before. So now what it's saying is we've got the subscription, the app service type, the app service name. Notice they're grayed out. That's because they're modified up here. If we unlink these, we could fill them in here instead. Now we will come down here to Runtime Stack, and we will change this to be the latest .NET Core. So we have .NET Core 1, 1.1, 2, so on. 3.0 is what it has, but it also has the LTS version, the long-term supported version, which right now is 3.1, or we can go latest, which when 3.2 comes out, which really won't affect ASP.NET web apps, but it would do 3.2. Okay, but let's do latest. And we'll hit save. And let's just hit OK on the folder name. We do need to change the release pipeline to be development deployment. So development deployment there. We'll hit save again. No comments necessary. Let's go back to the pipeline. But notice in here, I don't really have anything to do. Like I had one job, one task, but how does it know what to deploy? Well, if we go back to, whoops, wrong spot. If we go back to pipeline, there's so many different options in here. This is where we add an artifact. What's an artifact? Well, remember back in pipelines, we created an artifact. That was that zip file we called drop. So we can say add an artifact. It's from a build. Let's choose a build, the standard continuous integration build. And it's the latest version, the source alias, that's all fine. We hit OK. Notice we can pull this from somewhere else. We can also pull this from Azure repos for Git. We also have GitHub, TFVC, Azure Artifacts, GitHub releases, Docker Hub, Jenkins, and so on. So we can pull our artifacts from somewhere besides just the Azure DevOps. So again, this is all modular. If you want to use just pipelines or just releases from Azure DevOps, you could do that. It is nice to have it all integrated though, since it finds it very easily. We hit add. Now notice that it's going to trigger off of our continuous integration, right? Well, not quite yet. It's going to pull from our continuous integration, but it's not going to trigger off it yet. We have to hit this little lightning bolt here, click on that, and now we can say continuous deployment trigger enabled. But we have to specify a branch filter. So we say add and say I want the master branch to be included. So this is what's going to trigger the continuous deployment is a master build, a master branch build. So if I check code in on the master branch and it runs through and it successfully builds, then that successful build of the master branch is going to then trigger this to say, okay, now go launch that continuous deployment. And it's going to come over here to stages, and it's going to do this one job with one task. All right, so we can close that out. We hit save, hit OK. By the way, I don't put comments in those boxes, but when you're working on a production system, put comments there. If you go to history here, notice we have add, update, update, but it says nothing about what those were. This is where having a pipeline comment would help, because you can see, why did I change this? Actually, be over here. We're going to say, why did I change this? What did I do in this update? You can look at it and you can compare the differences. And so therefore you can see, okay, it's version 3, modified on date was changed. You can come scrolling down here and see that this is removed, but this was added. So these pipelines are JSON data that you could modify or at least see the differences for. But it's more helpful to have a comment. Okay, so just note that's what that is for. Now, the one more thing I want to do, now that we have continuous, our continuous integration hooked up and say, okay, this is what I want to point to, let's go to one job, one task, and under the deploy Azure App Service, go into package or folder. This is what gets deployed. Go to the ellipsis here. I want to select exactly what gets deployed. Notice we have multiple drops here. Where we add the SQL drop and the WPF drop. Well, under the API drop, we have the TRM API.zip. Now, if I didn't do this, notice that the default is grab anything that has a .zip. That's going to deploy the API. It's going to deploy the WPF, I believe. Oop, it doesn't have a .zip, it looks like. So it would technically still deploy just what we needed. That's more an accident than it is on purpose. So let's grab the specific one we want. We'll save that. I'm going to put a note here just so you see what the note looks like. This would be something like specified the API zip file for deployment. Okay. Now if we go to history, there's that message right there. Okay. Now how do we test this out? We have our deployment. We can create a release, which we're going to do, but I want to make sure we test out our API first. So let's go to our API and let's go to our URL. And we do this. We should be able to pull up our API once it launches. Notice it's slow the first time. That's because it's been turned off. I haven't been using it. And so the first time it launches, it's slow. It should be really responsive after this. But again, we're also using the cheapest version, so it's not going to be screaming fast. That's where we want to probably up the version a little bit and then optimize. Okay, so it's up. If we go to /Swagger, we can pull up the Swagger for this page. Cool. So now you can have something to refresh to make sure that this is indeed still working. So now let's come back to our pipeline. We'll manually create one, make sure it works. If it doesn't, we'll fix it. It happens. I often find that about my first 10 builds are a little rocky because I have to, fix one thing or I forgot a setting, those kind of things. So let's find out if this is going to work, and then from there we'll look at any modifications we need to do. One thing I note, we don't have to modify our connection string because inside of the TimCo API of the Azure, if we go to configuration, there are those two connection strings that are going to be overriding whatever goes in the folder. So we don't even have to modify our connection strings, which is really nice. So let's create a release. It's going to pull from development. And we hit create. Release 1 has been queued. Let's click on it. So this is the process. Now it's a very, very simple process because we've got just one thing here. But now let's click on this to watch what's happening. We can watch the logs. So it's downloading the artifacts from our build, and now it's going to deploy those once it's downloaded, which is done. So download all 3 artifacts, but we're only going to deploy the one. Okay, it's starting to update, and it looks like it's done. Let's refresh this to make sure it's still working. Again, it should take a little bit the first time, but it's still working. So we still have an API, it's still working. What we can do is make a slight modification to the code that would show up, probably let's show it up on the main page. So let's change this welcome just a little bit. Right now it says 2019. For our date, let's change it to 2020. So let's minimize this window. I've got the TimCo Retail Manager open. So let's go to the API. Let's open up the API itself. We'll go to Views, Home, Index. Oops, that's not where that is. That's under Shared, I believe, Layout. And then down here, yep. Which we can do is say at date time dot now. Let's do UTC now. No, let's do now dot year. So the difference between UTC now and now is that now will be the date for the server, whereas UTC now would be the date for Universal Time Coordinate, I believe, which is the right now for us it's I think -4. Daylight savings time messes it up, but it's not a big deal either way. In theory, you might see that if you are one time zone off from this server, it would say 2019 for an hour longer or an hour into 2020. That's not a big deal. Or I guess 2020 to 2021 because we've already passed 2019. So with that in place, that little modification, let's just make sure it runs. It should. But you should always test out whatever you're doing. So this is also going to launch both applications because of the fact that that's what we're doing, but we'll only look at this one. Notice 2020 now. Cool. So we can close it down, close our application. We have that one thing to commit, so let's make good changes. Let's stage our change, and this really big fix is fixed the copyright year. I guess we can capitalize Y. All right. Made the copyright year to be always correct by using date time. Okay. So commit stage and sync. So it's going to do a few things for us. One is going to show us the whole build process for continuous integration and also continuous deployment. It's also going to test to make sure that the commit on master does trigger the release, and it's going to test to make sure that our release works with a hands-off approach and that it refreshes that API with the right value. So it's going to do a few things. So now I've not only pushed, but I've also started a sync process. So that should go up. It did. Now let's go back to our browser. Let's go back to pipelines. And we should see that this is actually running. It's queued right now. So let's click on it. Notice it's got a queue right here. It's running. So we can click on this and you can watch this process go through. I'm going to pause the video. There's no reason for you to watch this whole long, drawn-out process. But then we'll come back and make sure that it does trigger the release. I'm not going to manually trigger release or anything, do anything, secret tricks. Okay, I'll just do it. I'll just pause the video so you don't have to watch the whole long process. And it looks like we're finished now. So let's go back to our releases. And notice we have a release running right now. So you can click on that. And it's currently deploying to Azure App Service. So without touching anything, just committing that code to master triggered the build. The build succeeded, which then triggered the deployment. The deployment is currently deploying to our Azure Web App. And it looks like it's going now. So it's starting to transfer. The transfer shouldn't take too long once it goes. There we go. So now I can come back over to our API and we can hit refresh here. Make sure that it says 2020. It does not yet. Okay, as you can see, it now works. It now says 2020, but that's a little bit of camera magic. I don't want to do camera magic. I want to talk to you about what I did and why. So this was not working. It was not refreshing, and so I paused the video and just started doing some work and testing, trying to figure out what the issue was. And this is something that you're going to go through. You're going to go through a lot of struggle. Now, I normally put that on camera, but I decided not to for this because it is a long, drawn-out process of, let's try this. Nope, that didn't work. And unfortunately, it's not a quick turnaround where it's like you see an immediate result. Instead, you see the result in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. In fact, it's been a little over an hour and a half since I first published this. So I first tried to do a release on this. So I did figure out the problem. I did a little bit of testing. I did do one more commit. Notice it says API main up here. That was just an additional commit to see if maybe it was just something to do with the 2020. That was the issue. Maybe the footer wasn't updating like it should, and that wasn't the issue. And the worst part, the most frustrating part is that in Azure, it was saying it worked. In fact, I had to open the tab back up and not sure why it closed. If you go to Deployment Center, now there's more since then because I've done a lot of work. But there is a number of deployments here, and they all say they worked, which is frustrating because it should be that some of them didn't work. But they all say they worked, it's just they didn't update. So I tried, stopping and restarting, thinking, man, that was the issue. And it turns out what the issue was is that we're using MS Build, but we're using it for, that's for Windows, and we need to use a .NET Core build that can run for Linux and also configure it to be a Linux build. So let's go to the pipelines, actually go back to the Azure DevOps and go to pipelines. And in our continuous integration build, we're going to hit edit. And we're going to fix this step right here, the build API. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to hit the plus button here and select .NET Core, which is it's a basically a command line option. We have a number of different options here. Notice it says .NET Build right now, but the drop down allows it to say publish or restore or build. Now, if we had unit testing here, then what I would do is I would do a build first, and then I would do a publish. So I'd do a build, and then I'd do my unit testing, test that out, make sure it all runs, and then once I know it all works, then I would publish. But I don't have that here, so I'm just going to hit publish. Now, one of the things with this .NET Publish is it will actually do a .NET Restore on the NuGet packages, which means we wouldn't need to do this if we were only going to be running off of this one web project. But since we have the SQL project and the WPF project, we'll leave the .NET or the NuGet and the restore for now. Later, I think we do want to come back and do our .NET build for all of these, or .NET publish for all of these probably. But we'll get there. For right now, we only have to do this one. I am going to put in some command line arguments. First one is -r, and this specifies the runtime, which is Linux-x64. So I run this on a Linux 64-bit machine. So that just allows the system to know how to compile this web project. And then you also need to set our output directory. Now, let's go over to this right here. We have our, this right here. I know it's kind of small. I'm going to zoom in just a minute. Let's copy this and let's zoom in here. Not great, I know. There we go. So this build artifact staging directory, build.artifact staging directory, I want to grab that instead of retyping it. So we're going to say space here and then -- output, and then that's the location to output our files. So we're going to output our files to the build.artifact staging directory. And that's a known variable that we're going to use, which then we can do a publish from that location. Now, just like before, it is doing a zip, and it's adding the project folder name to the publish path. It is doing a publish of all web projects. This is important because if you had more than one, it would publish more than one, and it would just put them in different folders, or give the file a different folder name based upon where it came from. So it's actually doing publishing all of them. We could specify, by unchecking this, specify just the project to target. I'm going to leave it alone since it doesn't hurt right now, and in the future it might help if we had more than one web project. That's all the configuration we need to do for the .NET Publish. Now I can come over to the Build API. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Control Options and uncheck the Enabled. What this allows you to do is take it out of the path for now, but if you have any problems, you can come back to it later and put it back in. That saves all those arguments I had, just in case I need them later. Now this should work because it's something I've done already once, but I'm just going to make sure that it does before I get rid of this. Now I'm going to save this, but not save and queue it. All right, so to save this, let's go back to our Release tab. I'm going to turn off continuous deployment. Okay, so the lightning bolt here and uncheck this and save it. And the reason why is because I want to make sure I get one good build in first. So I have an updated zip file that I can look at to make sure I have the right path for that zip file. It should be the same, but I want to make sure it is. So let's run the pipeline. Notice it's the pipeline, so this is a continuous integration step. Let's run this. This will take a little while. And it really is doing a redundant task now because of the fact that it's doing a .NET restore on our packages twice. But not the end of the world. We can optimize this later, but for now it works. And that's really the key number one, whether it's a full application or whether it's your build process, is if it does the job, that's great. Now, once it does the job, then optimize. But get to do the job first. Okay, and it looks like that one succeeded. So let's now go back to this job and look at the 4 published items, including the API drop, which has the trm api.zip file, which is 57 megabytes. Let's go to the release, and let's edit this and make sure that it's pointed at the right location. So select our Azure App Service, or deploy Azure App Service. Come down here to our build system and make sure that we're looking at the right location. So we'll select this. A little trick here, if it grays out when you select it, that means it's the current location, which means we can create a release for this. And if this works, what we'll do next is we'll make another modification just to verify that the whole process works correctly. So it's queued. Now we can go to in progress and look at what's happening. It shouldn't take very long to publish this. Publishes it pretty quick because it's just a zip file. And now that's succeeded. So it should be that if we refresh this, that it still works. And it seems to. I mean, it's all still there. So now let's do some other type of update to this page and go through the entire process. So let's go back to our Visual Studio. Let's open that back up. And we have the index page. And let's change this link here from learn about building web apps with ASP.NET Core to learning about deploying web apps. So let's do this. Let's copy the URL that I have. I'm going to grab this URL off screen. I'm going to paste it in here. This is the URL that helped me with the deployment of it. docs.microsoft.com is amazing. So use it, learn it, love it. So let's just say deploying web apps to Azure Linux. Okay? Just make sure you have a different index page, just so you see something differently when we launch it. Now we can go to Changes, and let's stage this, and we'll say Updated Index Page. That's fine. We're going to stage this, go to Sync, and say Push. So you already know we have no new things on the server. Now I can come back over here, go to Pipelines, and oh, by the way, we need to modify our release real quick because we turned off continuous deployment. Continuous deployment, we want the master branch. So we'll hit save on that. We should have plenty of time because the build is happening right now, or it should be. It is. So this, it's been taking 10 minutes. I'm sorry, 4 minutes. We'll see how long it takes. I'll pause the video and come back to it. Okay, that took about 2.5 minutes. So let's go to release. And this is already launched. So I'll wait for this to be done as well. Okay, and that is done as well. So let's go over to our API and we'll hit refresh. And there we go. Learn about deploying web apps to Azure Linux. And if you click on that, it'll take you right to that page that has more information about deploying to Linux and how you do that and the settings you'd use. So it took a little bit of pain, a little bit of struggle, and a little bit of work and a lot of time, but we now have a continuous deployment process running. We have our pipelines for continuous integration. We had to tweak one of those, or the only one, but then our release is going to pick up right where that leaves off, that zip file, and it's going to deploy our API. Now this is just API right now. We're going to add in database deployment soon, but just so you know, this is just API. So now we have our development deployment for our API. If we wanted to, we could rename this just to deployment, and then we could deploy to development and then staging and then production. So you could add a new stage like so, and that would add it down below, or we could add it afterwards as well. So just note that's possible to do. It's just not something we're going to do probably yet. Now there's also approvals here. So we could have a pre-deployment condition that says, hey, you have to approve this before it goes. That's what you'd do if you'd have chained for staging and deployment, or I'm staging and production. So if you have one of these, you can kind of see it when it goes on the screen. Notice it goes down below. So this is going to be done in parallel. So you can have another deployment here where it would be a database deployment, for example. We could have a separate deployment task for that. And you probably will do that. Now, if you want to have staging for this, we just say add, and notice it puts it afterwards. You can have a pre-deployment for this and say, okay, this is for staging, the next one's for production. And you could chain them and say, okay, do you want to allow this through or not? So a lot of stuff you can do here, a lot of different tweaks and configuration. But for us, for our case, we have our continuous deployment in and running, and it's working. Right now it's not the prettiest, and that's okay. We can clean it up and tweak it as necessary. All right, in the next video, I think what we're going to do is, before we get to the SQL deployment for our continuous deployment, I think we're going to go back over to the boards and start working on this bug list. If you've noticed, this list has grown. So as you have seen bugs in the code, or if you've tried the code out and you found some issues, you've let me know. And so there are a number of things tagged as a bug, suggestion, bug, and those are done. So there's a lot of stuff in here we need to kind of address. And a lot of this is quick stuff. For example, you can access the user menu before you sign in, which if you do that, it throws an error, but then does not allow you to log in. So that's a thing to fix. But it's not a huge thing. It's a pretty quick fix. So we'll probably address these bugs, which would be great because we can associate the bug with a commit, and we can see that commit walk all the way through into deployment into our development environment. Okay, so that's probably coming up next, and then after that we'll get to our database deployment, because most of these don't deal with a database. It's just the API some of it's the WPF as well. And then we'll also look at also trying to point our WPF project at our development API as well to see how that would work and switch between those environments. Okay, so that's all coming up in the future videos. That's kind of the next things on the list, and we'll see what we get to next. But until then, practice what you've done, try things out, try and break this, try and make it better, try and make it more efficient, and see what we can do to improve this build process and the deployment process. And if you can't deploy to Azure, which I understand because Azure is limiting somewhat the free stuff it's giving away right now because of the virus and the additional load on the Azure servers, the incredibly large additional load. So if you can't do that, you can deploy to other locations. So if we go back to release, you can go here and you can, let's just add this release, and we'll look at the tasks. Right now this is an Azure deploy, but if I hit the plus here and I go to deploy, I know it's kind of shrunken over. Here we go. So you can deploy to other locations. So for example, you can do a file copy to Azure. Well, that's Azure. But what if we came down here and looked at other options, copy files over SSH, an IIS deploy. You can do PowerShell on target machine. And there's even a Windows machine file copy, or if you want to do a search, up here, FTP. FTP is still an option you can do. And you can FTP files to a server. Now, I've been using a server of my own, a separate web host besides Azure, trying it out and seeing how I like it. And so far I like it. It's a little quirky to get going, but once you learn the patterns of how to use it, it's a really powerful server. It costs $5 a month. So that's InterServer. So here is the URL for that. So go to InterServer and then go to webhostingasp.net. And then you just say buy now. It's as low as $4 per month, depending on how many months you sign up for. So notice that if you sign up for 6 months, it's actually $4.75 per month. If you sign up for 36 months, that's when it becomes $4 per month. If you sign up month to month, it's $5 per month. So if you want to try it out, you sign up for $5 and then you give it a shot. This does, for $5 a month, you can have unlimited storage. You can have 25 websites, free SSL certificates. That's really nice. And you can have, as listed here in that little list, but it does have SQL Server included as well. So you get SQL and you get your web apps. So 25 web apps plus SQL databases. I don't think there's a limit on number of SQL databases. So that's pretty cool as well. I do have some videos showing you how to set this up. The link I'll provide down in the description to go to this is a referral link, just so you know. You don't have to use it, but if you use it, it won't hurt you at all. It won't in any way diminish your purchase if you decide to do that, but it would give me a little bit of a kickback as a thank you. So just note that's there. If you want to use it, you don't have to. So, but that's what I've been using. I'll try and publish the videos on how to work with this in the next week or so. I've already put it on the Blazor Server in-depth course as a bonus. So I included that so you can actually see how to use it. And I've got a course that's coming out this week on Udemy that also includes it as well, just as a bonus to try and make sure you understand how to work with a web host besides Azure. Okay, so that's another option. If Azure isn't working, you do want can't afford to pay $5 per month, that's a possibility. Even cheaper if you want to go a longer term. And that's a full real domain, okay, a real web host. Now, I don't purchase my domain names through them. I actually purchase my domain names through Namecheap because I like to have control over that. I talk through that in the other video as well that I'll post. So just, that is there as another alternative if you can't deploy to Azure. If Azure won't allow you to deploy, you can FTP those files over to InterServer. You can also, I believe, do an IS deploy as well. So that's it for continuous deployment. Hopefully you learned something from that. Thanks for watching. As always, I am Tim Corey.